So we are now fortunate to also have with us Executive Committee member Eric Brown. Eric's a high school biology teacher in Evanston, Illinois. And I'm looking to see if Eric is on deck here. I know that Eric's bringing us comments from the executive committee, and then he will also be working. He will be he will introduce our next keynote speaker. So
he's on, Shannon.
Okay, great.
All right. Good afternoon, NCUEA, and thank you, Vice President Shannon, and Chairperson President Brent, and the rest of the NCUEA leadership team. My name is Eric Brown, and just like all of you, we're getting through this together, and I'm showing you how you properly do things, right? This is what we're supposed to do, is wear our masks, and then when we have to do remote instruction, we maybe have to use these things, and so we transfer over our microphone so we can hear things properly and not be interrupted by outside noises. So let me see if I can get this done right. Is it working yet? You know, I think it is. All right. So again, I am Eric Brown, a biology teacher at Evanston Township High School, and I serve all of you on the NEA Executive Committee. I'm fortunate to be the Executive Committee's liaison to NCUEA this year because I get to bring greetings on behalf of all of my colleagues on the Executive Committee at this year's conference, which is centered on racial justice. So far, you've had two keynote speakers, Dr. Ricky Jones of the University of Louisville and Dr. Matthew Desmond of Princeton, who've discussed issues that have a disproportionate impact on people and communities of color, specifically Black people and Black communities. And who can forget the mighty shades of ebony, thank you, Kumar, who showed how our young people are heavily engaged in fighting for issues that impact all of us, to be sure, but especially, again, our BIPOC communities. And so as a Black person, born of two Black parents, it is my privilege to facilitate today's discussion with Mitchell Jackson, the author of Survival Math, whose work gives his readers insight into growing up Black in Portland, Oregon. Now, before our discussion with Mitchell, I want to delve a little bit more into the subject of racial justice. This term now seems ubiquitous and maybe even perceived as overused by so many that it's almost become sapped of its vitality, of its righteousness, and of its power. It's being used by well-meaning folks, but also commercialized and appropriated by corporations who have long been culpable of theft of Black Americans' wealth and opportunity. And I'm not only talking about a distant past, I'm talking about right now and all too recently, the Great Recession. Let's not forget how we got out of that Great Recession. It was a president by the name of Barack Obama and a vice president, Joe Biden, who helped us get out of that Great Recession. But let's just focus. The Washington Post reports that immediately prior to the Great Recession, Black families earning more than $200,000 annually were more likely on average to be given a subprime loan than a white family making $30,000 a year. That's right. Black applicants were more than twice as likely to receive a subprime loan than white applicants, regardless of their income. We shouldn't be surprised. These same entities supported redlining rather, in the not too distant past. And guess what? These banks today, they now recognize systemic racism, and they're developing programs to remedy inequity in the housing market to address the deficit of Black home ownership. I don't know if you saw Spike Lee's 2000 film Bamboozled or what you thought about it if you did, but you might want to check it out. You see, the remedies for racial injustice are what I want to unpack today. Despite the actions of some corporate behemoths, the specific remedies to racial injustice are very much still in question. We can point to the outcome of California's Proposition 16, which, had it been approved, would have overturned a 1996 decision by California voters, which banned the use of race-based and sex-based affirmative action. In 1996, 55% of California voters voted for the ban on race-based affirmative action in public hiring, contracting, and university admissions. Well, guess what? In 2020, when they were voting to repeal that ban, 57% of Californians voted to uphold the ban. So really, how far have we come? And it's not just at the state level. Unfortunately, it is very likely that race-based affirmative action admission policies at universities will be overturned by the majority conservative United States Supreme Court, in spite of any protestations of the Biden-Harris administration. See, remedies to address the deep racial injustices in this country, including affirmative action, we believe they should perform acts of restoration. That's what remedies really need to be, restorative acts. And so for the NEA, we now have these NEA demands. And I'm sure you heard our president, Becky Pringle, talk about these demands when she welcomed us all into the conference. Our NEA demands justice for Black lives articulate some of the needed remedies. These demands, which you can find at neaedjustice.org/BlackLivesThrive. Notice how we positively put this, neaedjustice.org/BlackLivesThrive. And I see that it's been dropped into the chat, so click on it. Those demands include transforming policing policies for safe and just communities, creating healthy and strong communities and schools, empowering communities and schools, and ensuring the right to vote for Black, Brown, Native, and AAPI voters. And we know how important it is that we secure our rights to vote. We still have elections going on in Georgia, and we need to make sure that we get every person who is able to vote, and that every vote gets counted. So if you haven't already, please sign on to the NEA demands document by going to neaedjustice.org/BlackLivesThrive. Again, it's in the chat. And then get your local to adopt a similar statement of support of justice for Black lives. Now, there are many different paths to achieve these demands, but Black voices are central in determining what these paths look like. I know that the demands for racial justice are demands that NCUEA locals believe in, because these are demands for social justice and for a stronger, more united country. I ask you to join NEA and one another on this path to realizing racial justice, not just in our classrooms, but also in our communities. We know that this isn't an endeavor that should be taken alone, because it only can happen and be achieved if we do it together. NEA, NCUEA, and all of our local leaders working together are needed to make the difference. So please, what's the website? neaedjustice.org/BlackLivesThrive. And now let me change my virtual well, that's not my virtual background, that's my real background, because this is what we do too, right? When we have our students with us, sometimes we have to change our virtual background. There's one, let's use this one. So we're going to talk about books. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Mitchell Jackson. Mitchell is the author of the acclaimed book, Survival Math, Notes on an All-American Family, and is an assistant professor of writing at the University of Chicago. In Survival Math, Mitchell gives us not just glimpses, but deep insights on what it's like to grow up as a Black boy and survive as a Black man in Portland, Oregon. Now, I wish I had written a book about growing up as a Black boy in Cleveland, Ohio, but I'm not the writer nor the storyteller that this gentleman is, not in any way. Oh my gosh, this book was powerful. Mitchell Jackson, if you are here, and I think you are, please say hello to all of our NCUEA colleagues. Thanks for being here.
Hello, everyone. I want to say thank you to the NCEAU for having me. And I sat in on the last panel, very informative panel, very inspirational. And Eric, thank you for your passionate speech and your introduction. And I'm just hoping when we start talking that you don't ask me any biology questions. This could go really bad if I get some biology questions. I spent a lot of time anguishing over what I was going to read today, given the audience and you all working with young people. And I decided on an excerpt from Survival Math, which is a memoir / essay collection that covers my growing up in Portland, Oregon. And I want to preface it by saying the reason I chose this excerpt is because while it doesn't involve me being a child, it was when I was in my youth. And it was a moment where, a kind of watershed moment for me where had I not had education in front of me, my life could have gone a different direction. And so I want to read a part of an essay that is called Exodus. If you don't want to buy the book and want to read the essay, I think it's in the Paris Review. But yes, I'm going to read a little bit of this essay. My exodus occurs after years wandering the wilderness of my hometown, the crucible that included working a part-time and only time gig at the Oregonian's downtown insert facility, stacking pallet after pallet of inky ass newspapers. For bread to live, for bread to leave. The day in question, I got a phone call from someone who, for the love and just maybe his freedom, I'll call Brother A. Brother A called me to plead a ride to his apartment in the burbs to sweep for dope after his dope dealing roommate, a dude who'd already done a nickel in the pen on a drug charge, which, by the way, is not judgment, just context, had got knocked by the feds. Brother A explained he needed the ride because his main squeeze had wrecked his Jeep and he couldn't think of anyone more fitting than me, of all people on God's green earth, me, to be the one to shuttle him. Hell no. That should have been my answer, but that was not my answer. My answer tugged me out of my job at the end of my shift and into the forest evergreen Lexus I'd bought in the bygone unblessed days when I sold more than weed. It sent me bolting out of my job and into my ride to swoop Brother A from someplace close and hit the highway with most dubious sense. I'm guessing now is as good a time as ever to mention that this was the age during when I might have been selling weed, selling chronic, stacking papers, and throwing parties because evermore this brother, every brother should diversify his hustle. And there are no mights or maybes to that. Memories from that age, hypothetical and otherwise, seldom feature date stamps, but I can assure you this incident occurred May 2002, which I know for truth because one of my homeboys and me had just thrown a well-attended Memorial Day party, and between my cut of the door profits from the weed I may have been selling and the knot of bills in my inky work jeans, I was feeling at least extra medium about myself. Brother A and I traded lightweight banter en route, and before I knew it, we'd reached the apartment complex, grounds of such expanse there was plenty of time for my post to cease between the moment I pulled into the lot and when I found a place to park my tree-colored ride. I can't speak for Brother A, but in the interstice between arriving and stepping a wary foot out of my ride, I had visions of police swarming us from bushes and vans, seizing discomfited me, slamming my cheek against an unforgiving asphalt, and kablowing on cuffs. We did not get ambushed that moment. We hustled past a passel of blithe youngsters and mounted a flight and a flight and a flight of stairs and stood at the threshold of his apartment, my heart athunder, and asked each other again and for the last time if we should enter, which, inhale, of course we did. So I'm gonna fast forward a little bit. We're inside of the apartment and we hear Patter, 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 patter. Heard them and said to myself, wow, those kids outside. Patter, 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 patter. Wow, those must be some heavy-footed kids. Mused, there must be more kids than I thought. That's when Brother A hustled over to the peephole and said, oh shit, police. Before I could move, a mob of police, sheriff, and DEA bum rushed into Brother A's crib. Get on the ground, get on the ground, keep your hands or we can see them. Get down, they said. Oh my God, I thought and dropped to my knees, then prostrate. Brother A darted into the living room and ranted, let me see your warrant, let me see your warrant. And in an instant, they spun him face to wall and cuffed him. One officer jerked me off the carpet and asked if I was carrying drugs, if I had anything in my pockets which might cut or poke him. No, I said. And he emptied my pockets, beheld my cell phone and pager and the knot of cash, most of which, let me remind you, I'd made from throwing a Memorial Day party. More officers appeared, one of them tugging a stout German shepherd. That same officer informed me that if the dog hit on anything in my pockets, he would have to confiscate it. He let his canine loose. It sniffed my wrinkled wad of bills and barked. Oh my God, I thought. The next moment, an officer bopped into the apartment carrying a bag of weed that could have been a facsimile of the one my brother had showed me not a few posters ago. He announced he'd found it in the sprinkler outside and asked which one of us it belonged to. And Brother B, A, and me bucked our eyes at each other and damn near shook our heads off our shoulders. Huh? What's that? We never seen that in life, we said. He crooked his lip and warned if he found either of our fingerprints on the bag, he'd charge us. He asked me if I knew Brother A's roommate. Yes, I know him. I don't know him well, just a high and by, but yes, I've met him. He asked if I knew Brother's roommate sold drugs. Well, he did? I said, I had no idea. He asked if I'd ever been to prison. Yes, I said. One time, just one time though. He asked me what I'd gone to jail for. For selling drugs, I said, and the rest fell out of my mouth. But it's not what you think. I don't do it anymore, officer. I'm going to be a writer, officer. You've got to believe me, officer. I'm moving to New York in a few months for graduate school, officer. This looks bad, officer, but it's not how it looks. My word, officer. Just a few months till I leave, I said. Please, officer, please. You've got to let me go. So I didn't really want to be reading about selling drugs to the nice people in the conference, but I did think that that was a moment where education really did save me. I had a scholarship at the time to attend New York University as a creative writing major. And had I not had that scholarship, there's really no telling. I certainly wouldn't be sitting here on this Zoom call with you all. And so I do think it's really important that the work that you all are doing is rescuing kids or directing kids away from those kind of circumstances so they don't have to have the moment that I had at 23, 24 years old. So that's really why I wanted to read that and just really want to thank all of you who are in the schools now, who are wearing your mask and taking the health risks to teach our young people, all of the people who are helping. I think this is such a great tagline. Black Lives Thrive.
Yes.
You know, at that moment, I thought I was trying to thrive, but I had a really stilted idea of what thriving looked like. And so, yes, I just, really want to say appreciative and thanks for all that you all are doing and steering our young people in a different direction than me. We don't need any more people to take the lumps that I took.
Well, let me tell you something, Mitchell. And you go by Mitch, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah, either one,
okay.
Either one.
I want to call you how you call yourself, and if Mitch is the way to do it, I'm going to do that. Okay. I just wanted to say thank you actually for joining us, and you are on the right path, right? And so that's that's what we have to realize when we're working with students, is that they might make some mistakes, but it's up to us to help guide them and help them find that they do have choices and that they can make choices not just today, but even in the future, that can put them on the path that they need to be on for success. So I also want to talk about some housekeeping issues really quickly. For folks that have questions, if you have questions, we're using our Zoom's Q&A feature. So don't use the chat box as much. If you can just type on the Q&A feature, and I know that you guys have been doing this, or you all have been doing this all weekend so far, so you know how to use it. Use the Q&A feature to ask questions. And if we have time for Q&A at the end, we're going to make sure that we have Mitch respond to those questions. And with that, we've already heard so much from you that's really deeply personal. And so what I want to do is acknowledge that you've got a lot of interesting nuggets of knowledge. And we want to explore as much as we can with a little bit of time that we have with you, because a lot of it's coming from this truly honest and deeply personal sharing of your lived experience. And as I was reading the book, I'm not going to say that I had the same experiences as you, because I didn't, but a lot of the descriptions that you had about your family and how you interact with members of your family, and the family being the Black family, like it's a very extended form of family. It's very similar to like my own kind of recollections of my experiences. And so survival math to me confirmed that the second wave feminism's maxim, the personal, is intensely political, and it still has resonance. So before we get into a deeper discussion on the book, which again is intensely personal and I believe political, I'm curious about your thoughts on electoral politics, including the Biden-Harris recent victory. What are your family members, your community, folks that you have featured heavily in the book, what do they think about this Biden-Harris victory and what it means for them and or Black lives?
I have an almost apolitical. My immediate family, my mother, my brothers. While we were all growing up, we were pretty much apolitical. We didn't have political conversations. My mother, if she voted, she would have voted Democrat, but she didn't really try to imbue us with a kind of political ideology. And it was strange because I actually just wrote an essay about this in my column. The first year that my mother had voted in 30 years. So my mother, as a Black woman, was compelled to vote in this election. So I think she even realized the direness of what we were facing and are still facing. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful, but I'm also hopeful with, an amount of skepticism. There's so much, it almost seems like the outgoing administration spent a lot of time trying to undo the previous administration. And unless you have somebody keeping tally of all the damage that was done, I think this administration could spend the first few years trying to undo the damage of the last administration. So I hope that someone in the Democratic Party was actually keeping score, and that they know all the places to look for the corruption and the malfeasance that we've had over these last 4 years. But in terms of my family, I'm just really proud that everyone went out to vote. I took my 14-year-old son with me to vote. So he went for the first time to accompany me. So I'm establishing a legacy that did not exist for me. I never went with my mother to vote. I never went with my grandfather to vote. So I think, again, I'm trying to establish norms in my family that just didn't exist. And, my family comes from Alabama, which was, once the seat of the Confederacy. So for us to be as apolitical as we have been for a generation or two really is, it's almost unfathomable, but it was the case. So I'm gonna get that Alabama blood running through us and make sure we have it going forward.
Thank you so much for that. And what I heard you say is actually written in your book too, on page 180 under Culture File, where you talk about, as impressionable boys, they witnessed grown folks riot in Watts and Detroit, ogled news footage of Johnson signing JFK Civil Rights Act into writ. That act all but nixed the rallying effect of an explicit foe, but did little in the immediate to uplift them and theirs. And so I think, and I hope all of us understand that just because we got rid of the current guy in the White House and replaced him with Biden and Harris, we're not done.
Yeah.
Don't go and rest on your laurels now and think that everything's just good and fine and dandy, because it's not.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate that. And one of the other reasons why I brought that up is in your first chapter, which you've already given us an excerpt from Exodus, you talk about the possible reasons that your family migrated from Alabama to Portland, Oregon. And one of those reasons is that your great grandmother, Mama Edie, is that how you say Edie?
Yeah.
All right, Mama Edie moved out to Portland with the express intent of helping to integrate the Portland Public Schools, a district that announced soon after Brown versus the Board of Education that it would take no action regarding desegregation. So could you talk more about the lives of your Mama Edie and your great grandfather Bubba when they first moved to Portland, and a little bit about the racial and ethnic demographic profile of Portland, and just whatever else you want to share about that lived experience?
Yeah. I didn't even think about how my great grandmother is like a forebearer for this. Actually, her and all of her aunts, so my great aunts, were all school teachers. Back in her generation, that was really one of the few jobs or education that you can get. Go to teacher school. And yeah, she did move to Oregon to integrate the schools. I think the most important thing to understand about Oregon is it has a long legacy of exclusion for Black people and racism. That they had a racist covenant in their original constitution, one of the only states that had one. So it's always been a antagonistic relationship between Black people and white people in Oregon. To give you a sense, the very first chapter or the prologue of the book is a letter to a guy named Marcus Lopez, who was the first Black person on record to step foot in what became Oregon. And he was actually killed by natives, though, killed the day that he stepped foot in Oregon. And that was August 16th, 1788. And I thought that his death was so emblematic of the kind of relationship that Blacks would have in Oregon. And, if anyone was paying attention to this summer, how there was such upright activity going on during the Black Lives Matter movement, that while Oregon has this kind of popular, master narrative of being a liberal bastion, it's also a bastion for white supremacy and far right activity. So you can ask yourself, how can one place have those two kind of ideologies coexist? And I didn't really kind of feel the white supremacy every once in a while. Like we had some skinheads or neo-Nazis that would beat someone up, and one time someone was murdered. So I didn't necessarily feel it that way. But now, having taken a step back from Oregon and being able to look at it a little more clear with a little more vantage, now I see how much of my experience was shaped by a really kind of anti-Blackness.
Yeah, one of the things that I really, really appreciated about your book, first, not only did I learn a lot about you, but you put a lot of history tidbits in there, some of which I knew about, like, on a very surface level. And because we have this wonderful thing called the interwebs or Google, I was able to do a little bit more research into that entire prologue, and it was just it was a really awesome history lesson at the same time that I learned about your experiences in life. So if anybody wants to buy this book, I think we'll drop the small independent bookstore link that you can go to purchase the book, because you will learn not just a lot about Mitch, but a lot about our history as America. So maybe diving a little bit into the structural racism. We talk a lot about it, the sets of policies, practices, and norms that result in the continued subordination and marginalization of Native peoples and people of color. But less frequently discussed is how those structures manifest between Black people in their intimate relationships. And you did a great job doing that. In your chapter titled Apples in particular, you discuss the relationship between your two parents and the love between your parents. You write, no matter how much your father loved her, and I believe in my puny, credulous heart that he loved her. By the way, not only did I learn about history, I learned a lot of vocabulary reading your book. You had a lot Your use of the English language is amazing. And I believe in my puny, credulous heart that he loved her. Mom had little to no action at being coveted because dad and his pimp partners and untold others had been convinced that the white men who concocted the white race are rulers of the universe. And since a woman who accepts whiteness as the crux of her identity, is the apple of that man's eye, she could also be viewed as the apple of the world. Can you unpack this idea a little bit more for us and maybe talk about how this might differ from even internalized racism?
Yeah. That essay is one. I'm glad that you mentioned like that the essay collection is personal, because it always started for me, whatever essay is there or chapter always started in personal, but then it always moved to me trying to contextualize whatever that personal experience was. And in this case, it sent me on a mission to unpack the idea of whiteness. So I read, Nell Painter, I read, the invention of whiteness, the invention of the white race, all these, kind of seminal texts. And the thing that I had kind of struck me was how whiteness did not exist in the way that we have it now until America came around. But if you kind of look back at the kind of long trajectory of whiteness, you can see it in like Greco-Roman art, right? In the way that they would paint the statues, of white, and the way that the forms that they were using. So I think if we kind of move that into the contemporary, one thing that if we connect it to maybe politics, right? Like I did not memorize the exit poll, but I remember in the last election how many white women had voted for Trump. And it seemed to me like a protection of whiteness, even at the expense of their own rights and privileges. And so to me, there seems like a kind of recognition that whiteness is the kind of overarching binding value system in America. And, if we look at it now, like who actually voted for the guy who just lost, I mean, it's overwhelmingly still white people. So I think there's really the statistical data, there's really no denying that idea. But also, I think if we look back at history, we can see how white women have also been protected by white men or used by white men to oppress other groups. So if we look at lynching, if we take a look at, the work of Ida B. Wells, like it was often a white woman saying that she felt disrespected or endangered, and then the white man would come in and do whatever he was going to do. So I can kind of understand how a young Black person who didn't really have a sense of the history, that hadn't studied whiteness, like why would my dad and his brothers be studying whiteness, would kind of be indoctrinated to believe what the white man made them believe, which was that our women are the apple of the world, right? That they're the most important, because without the white woman, we don't have a white race anymore. And so my dad spent a lot of time coveting those women at the expense of my mother, who is Black and who was a dark-skinned Black woman. And I saw the damage that did to her. And on the one hand, I do blame him for the immediate, harm that he caused. I also understand what it's like to be indoctrinated to believe some things without having the context to actually interrogate them. So there's like a twofold thing, right? Like, how can you get out of this space if we don't give them the context? Which also makes me think about like the 1619 Project, which I'm sure all of you all have had to engage with in some way, right? Like, do you teach it? Do you not teach it? Well, what's the hell is this 1776 project they got going on over here? So I think, again, it's like giving people the information that they need to contextualize whatever their current circumstances are. To me, that's one thing that I wish I would have had in my history classes is the recognition that how this history was actually shaping my present circumstances. And that's one thing I try to do in the book. I know it's a long-winded answer and I was whining around, but Teach the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones is brilliant.
That's right. That's right. And use your book too, I would say, because it's again about this personal experience and the vocabulary, the history, and how you make it all personal and relatable is really important too. So if you haven't read the book, please read this book. Tell us a little bit more about the scale, because I think that has a lot to do with how, we as Black males, or just we as males maybe, kind of are taught how to operate and how to act. So, I interpreted the chapter a little bit about patriarchy and men's power and privilege over female bodies. Men on the scale, commit repeated offenses against women, deeds that could be considered criminal, and that coercing women to accept living in a world far below their potentials, to abide disappointments, deceptions, affronts, to mute the voice that chides them against expecting better, are all violences. So maybe for those of us who maybe haven't read the book yet, what is the scale first?
Well, that
and
was a
then
really good
how do you come off of it?
section you chose to explain it. When I was coming up in the 1990s or late 1980s, I was very much influenced. I mean, I should back up and say that my father and his uncles were all hustlers. They were all pimps at one time. And as we know, pimps do not have admirable relationships with women.
And you mean that in the literal sense?
In a literal sense, like this is how they supported themselves. So I have a distinct experience, which is, most people probably don't have that experience, but I will say that I think coming up, I was, convinced, indoctrinated, persuaded to believe in this kind of bulletproof, what we call now toxic masculinity. And before it was toxic masculinity, it was a survival strategy. And, not only was I given this as a young child, not only did I have this exemplars in my father and his brothers, I was also came along in the kind of heyday of rap music, which kind of took took the paradigms and gave them a voice and made them ubiquitous in the culture. So I believe that, and I operated like that for most of my 20s, I would say. And there's a lot of kind of self-deception that you have to do to be able to operate in that way in your interpersonal relationships. And so the scale is me not only admitting that and trying to reconcile that, but it's also trying to figure out, well, where did this come from? And I think, so often we kind of create a hagiography for men who have done these terrible deeds to women. I think, one of the people I talk about in there is JFK, like who's venerated, but if we take a look at JFK's relationship to women, like I think we have to reevaluate that. Or Picasso, who's maybe the most terrible womanizer of all time, but also like, the greatest artist of the 20th century. So it's really me trying to figure out the kind of legacy of this. Where did it come from? How has it harmed people? And ultimately, for me, it was a personal reckoning with women who I'd harmed in my intimate relationships. And I'll say that it was the toughest thing that I have ever written. I remember writing a version of this and giving it to my editor, who was a woman, and who is a woman. She wasn't a woman, who is a woman. And she couldn't read the whole thing and like gave it back to me and was like, this is just terrible, Mitchell. But I also knew that kind of response meant that I was onto something, and that I had to figure out a way to be able to share that kind of information. Because I think another thing about Black men, at least from my era or in my city, is that we didn't have outlets to talk about this kind of self-harm and harm that we were doing. And so there was no therapy, so I do think if this allows someone to kind of reckon with what they've done, if it pushes them towards therapy, if it pushes them towards a reckoning with, some people that they've harmed, that it was worth my agonizing over creating it.
Yeah, and that's I don't know if you would consider yourself having grown out of or off,
Yeah,
like
I hope
taking
so.
the tax off the scale, right?
Yeah.
But you know, I this is one of the sections that I read that I totally related to because my dad was very similar.
Okay.
Not in the pimping way, but in the womanizing kind of way.
Yeah.
And you know, it's just like, how do you grow out of it?
Yeah.
And I can't imagine that all the men in your life were on the scale, or
No.
were they? And how did you learn to kind of transition yourself, or who was it that you looked to help you get off of the scale?
Yeah. Well, no, all the men in my life were not. There's another essay that I have in the book called Composite Pops about the men in my life who kind of were like surrogate fathers for me and the positive role modeling that they did for me. So I did always have that. I think it was just maybe overwhelmed. And also, they didn't have the advantage of having a cultural they didn't have hip hop going for them. So not only was it whatever was happening in my personal life, there was also this music and this kind of lifestyle that I was listening to. Not to blame all of this. I'm not blaming this on rap music, but it is, it does disseminate information. And yeah, I think how do you grow out of it? I think you first have to recognize it. One of the things that I try to do in that piece is to talk about what violence is, because I think too often we think of violence as only kind of physical harm, but I argue that violence is also emotional harm. So to be able to kind of take a look at the ways in which you've been violent in your interpersonal relationships forces you to reckon with it, right? Because like most people would say, like, I'm a nonviolent person, like I don't want to just beat someone up. But if you're causing this kind of physical this emotional harm, then you are being violent to someone. And can you take ownership of that? And then what is that, inspiring you? So yeah, I mean, it's long, hard work. I don't think it's almost like addiction, right? Like no one is ever fixed. It's like a conscious decision that you make moment to moment in your interpersonal relationships. And one I don't think that you can make again without understanding the broad context of this and understanding patriarchy and where it comes from and understanding whiteness and how it operates and understanding what kind of struggles women are going through. All of those things are, to me, wrapped into this idea.
Yeah. You know, I wish we had more time, because I would totally like to talk about how you as a father now are helping to your son get through this challenge of being on the scale and seeing all these examples out there. But unfortunately, we don't have that much time, and I want to make sure we stick to some of the stuff that's in the book.
Okay.
In part 3, what have we endured? You have a chapter titled Fast 10, Slow 20. In it, you discuss the creation by white America of the other America,
Yeah.
or the Jim Crow South, or the ghetto, the slum, the North Side, South Side, East Side, West Side, the hood, the block, and importantly, how the people forced to live in this other America survive economically. And I like how you dissect the term survive in this chapter too. So the 3 archetypes that you described: the scrambler, the survivalist, and then the hustler. Can you tell us more about these different archetypes? Are they unique to Black America, or can they be applied to other racial groups, other ethnic groups? And then, yeah, tell me about that.
So one, I think, yes, man, this is such a great read of this book. Like, you're taking me to places I haven't been in a year, 2 or 3. So I was this essay came out of me thinking about me hustling, but also my uncle, who was a long time hustler, but who, if you watch anyone who hustles for their life, there's a tail end of it where it just goes bad. Like I don't know any kind of lifetime hustlers that like ride off into the sunset with a bunch of money. But then I started thinking about, well, where did this concept of a hustler come from? And I was trying to trace it specifically to Black people, which there would have been no need to hustle in this sense before the Emancipation Proclamation, right before slavery, right? So then I thought that the first hustlers must have been born in Reconstruction, during which, you know, there were being arrested for being idle when they couldn't get jobs, right? So really, hustling was born of a necessity because white people would not give Black people opportunities. So to me, we now look at a hustler as something that is negative, but it came out of necessity. Then while I was hustling, I was always comparing myself to other, I mean, I'm fast forwarding obviously very far ahead from 1865 to the 1990s, but when I was hustling, I would always compare myself to other guys who would go further. There, you know, like there were times when a guy would say like, here, put your money with me and go to California and we can buy up everything and come back. And I would say, no, that's not something I was willing to take. So then I started to try to imagine what were the kind of categories of people who were involved in this world. So the scrambler is a person who was like just trying to get by through their circumstances, right? So you're not really making progress. You're more you're reactionary. And then I'm sorry, the survivalist is just trying to survive and get by. And then the scrambler is someone like another level who's like, you know, you're still kind of reactionary to what the circumstances are. But a hustler is someone who has committed to being this. It is their identity. Like when people say like, I am a poet, I am a hustler in a sense that this is who I am and this is how I'm going to operate in the world. And to me, the hustlers are maybe the most dangerous because they don't have a backup plan. They're like the person who only sees the end product. But again, I think all of these categories are born out of a dearth. They're born out of oppressive policies, right? Like no one grows up and says, I want to be a hustler who has access to education, who has access to, you know, housing, who has access to extracurricular activities. Like that it doesn't happen. So while I want to kind of understand it, I also want people to be less inclined to kind of penalize it. But this is also not to say that I'm advocating for people selling drugs, but even that, you know, in my home state in Oregon, they just legalized cocaine, heroin, like all of these hard drugs have been legalized in Oregon now. So it, you know, what would happen to the people who were doing long jail terms with these kind of substances back in the day? It's not even criminalized anymore, right? So even our idea of what is a criminal and what is a hustler is based on the people in power, right? Like they have the ability to say, this is legal, this is not, this is stigmatized, this is not stigmatized. So yeah, so that's what the hustling came out of me kind of thinking about that and trying to figure out the long legacy, man. I was like, who was the first guy that was like, I'm a hustler? He must have been like 1866, you know, like I'm not going to jail, I'm about to make it.
Yeah, yeah. And so what about like, because you've seen it kind of originated from the Reconstruction post-Civil War era,
Mm-hmm.
are these uniquely Black then, or are these archetypes something that you would see across ethnicities in America?
No, I think they are not uniquely Black. I think they are uniquely oppressor and oppressed groups. So, you know, if we think about the Italian mob, like when the Italians got here before they were allowed access into the white race, they had to create their own sense of wealth, right? Same thing with the Irish, right? So, no, it's not. I don't think it's a Black thing. I think it's a we don't have access to power thing. And this is one way to kind of circumvent these oppressive forces. But also I would say the Black people are the lone group, not the lone group, but one of the few groups that cannot get into whiteness, right? So while Italians and Irish, they can hustle for a little while and then they can become white, we will never be allowed to become part of the white race. So we will always have the stigma. So I think that's the difference between the different ethnic groups.
Yeah, very, very true. And the what I have a question, and I don't know if you have an answer to this one, but in Illinois, which is where I live, we just recently, got the marijuana recreational, and they part of the legislation actually expunged the records of folks who had been convicted of like marijuana offenses of certain types. And I'm just wondering if in Oregon, when they did the similar passage of their law, if they were expunging records of people who had been convicted of, minor offenses with some of those drugs too. But if you don't know the answer to that, don't worry about it.
I do not know the answer to that, but I know that they had passed a marijuana law previous. So y'all a little late on the legalizing marijuana. We already on the hard drugs, but they did expunge. It did come with some expungement. So I imagine that they will do that now for certain, amounts. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I think it's important is because, if you're weighing, right, if you're weighing the possibilities of you having your record expunged or how it's going to impact your life in the future, it might be considered something like survival math. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when you're, to get us back to the book, in your penultimate chapter, Survival Math, you muse about the reason. See, I'm using my vocabulary too now.
Yeah.
You muse about the reason you were able to resist doing business that would dictate a future of dire distress. That it was not because of your elders or God, save the simplest survival math. You have yet to meet a man whose life is worth more than mine. That's how you say it. So
Yeah.
it kind of sounds like exceptionalism, maybe. I don't know. I don't think you would characterize it as such, and I'm not sure if that's how I characterize it either. But how would you characterize this survival math and how you were able to do this when so many around you maybe didn't, or maybe they did, and just talk to me about that.
That is a great question. And actually, all of these have been great questions, man. This is one of the best conversations I've had in so long, man. We need to chop it up. I'm also in Illinois, matter of fact. I'm in Chicago. But I do think it is.
Wait, I'm in Chicago.
Yeah,
I'm on the north side.
Come around the corner.
I'm on the north side. Are you on the north side or the south side?
I'm at Hyde Park.
Oh, you're on the south side. Okay. Well, I'm in Uptown.
I do think it's exceptionalism. I think anyone that escapes, or maybe escapes is not the right word. I think that anyone that comes out of a depressed community to achieve some measure of social status and success has to believe themselves exceptional. At the same time, though, you have to be able to hold these paradoxes that you are both exceptional and no better than anyone in your circumstances. I'll give you a funny example of this. While I was in prison, I remember a guy coming in. I was in a dorm, not in a cell. I was in a dorm, and I remember I was playing dominoes, and there was a guy that came in that I knew from outside of prison, an older guy. And he walked in, and he looked at me at the table, and he said, "Man, what are you?" Because everyone knew I was in school, and they're like, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm doing time, man. The same time as you. Come on over here and have a seat, and let's play these dominoes." And to me, in that is both the thing that I recognize that I am not the one that people believe is supposed to be in these circumstances. And yet I am here and I am no better than you. So let's make the most of our circumstances at this particular moment. And I think that was really what saved me. Like, there were moments when the exceptionalism would be on my shoulder and say, "No, Mitch, don't go buy that package. No, Mitch, they robbed you. You probably shouldn't go shoot them, Mitch. That's not a good idea." And then there were the other things that said, "Well, I'm no better than them. Like, I'm gonna go get some money and get my mama out the drug house and all of this stuff too." So I always had both of these things. And luckily, this kind of idea of exceptional kind of outweighed this other idea of like, I am of the people. I think you got to have both of those to really survive a certain kind of circumstance.
Yeah, I like how you put that too, where you're balancing. You're not your statement did not say, "I have yet to meet a man whose life is worth as much as mine."
Right. Yeah. Right.
It was worth more than mine, and so
Yeah.
you equate life, but at the same time, that yours is not more important right? And you're not ready to risk your life to take somebody else's.
Yeah.
That was tough, is reading a lot of again, your experiences and how you weighed that, but then how you had friends that maybe didn't make the same choices.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about like how your relationships with some of your contemporaries
Mhm.
kind of led to you having different choices?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that there's in particular, like I remember young men who would say like, I don't give a F. And some people say that and they don't, it's just something to say, like they don't really mean it. But I think at a certain point they say it enough that they actually start to believe it. And they become a kind of misanthrope. And so the person that you're, I think, referring to is a guy in survival math who was a guy I went to high school with, a nice, fairly nice young man whose street name was Stitches, who later on became a gang member, started using casual drugs, and really just he started to say it and believe it. And he's the guy that one of the guys that put a gun on me and robbed me. But later he actually became a murderer, and he would tell you like, "I am a murderer," and not just I murder people, but like I am a murderer, right? Like that was a part of his identity. He was moving through the world like that. And to me, I don't want to categorize anyone as like a super predator, but there are people who have given up on humanity, right? There are people whose circumstances have beat them down so much. And this is such a small percentage of the population, but there are these people. And so in my circumstances, I had to be able to recognize who was the guy that really believed that, who had moved so far over that there was no saving them. And again, it's a kind of skill set that they don't teach you in elementary school or middle school. Maybe you can recognize a few implicit biases, but it is something, a kind of algebra or calculus that you must manage. I mean, I think it's really no different from, if anyone, I'm sure a lot of you have read Between the World and Me, and it's really when coach is talking about walking home and the guys like they want his jacket, and he knows like if he knuckles up, it's like he is going through survival math in that moment, right? He knows what can happen to him in those circumstances, and luckily he makes the right decision, right? He does the right calculations of survival math, and now we have Ta-Nehisi Coates versus a guy who got beat up and stabbed and shot in Baltimore in 1988.
Yeah. Speaking of Between the World and Me, when is Survival Math going to be on HBO or Netflix or?
There is a short film for it, and it'll probably air pretty soon. I'm actually talking to some people about airing it. It's not long like that Between the World and Me, which was beautiful, and I hope you all go watch it. If you all haven't watched it on HBO Max, here I am plugging Ta-Nehisi like he needs more audience, but yes, it is amazing. You should go and watch it. And we actually have a conversation. I think it's in January. He and I have a conversation, so maybe Google it if you want to hear us chopping it up a little bit.
Well, I hope he understands that his life is not worth more than yours either. So he's hopefully doing the same thing. So I want to move to some questions that we have in the Q&A box. So again, if you have a question for Mitch, please put it into the Q&A box from Zoom. One of the first questions I see here is just why do you call the book Survival Math?
Yeah.
And not just the survival math part, but also the notes on an all-American family. Tell us about that part of it too.
Yeah, so again, great question. It is survival math because I think on the whole, I mean, I was talking about the particular essay where I had to make calculations when I was confronted with what I thought was a mortal threat. So it was like, what do I do to really ultimately survive this, physically survive this? But I also think that people who are disenfranchised or marginalized are constantly forced to make survival math calculations. Even now during COVID, we are all making survival math calculations. Am I going to wear this mask when I walk outside? Am I going to risk, looking for a job because I can't get the government check that I need? I have a conflict with person A. How am I going to resolve this conflict? So I do think that survival math really, and if you think about it now, the nation is engaged in survival math. Like, what is the national will? Last week we had Thanksgiving, and the government told us, stay your ass at home. Do not travel. This ain't time to go eat with your family. And what happened? We had the largest travel day in airline history, or maybe this year. So people were not listening. So to me, that says that the national will is against surviving, right? Like, if you are not at this point managing that, that means that you are on the opposite side of surviving. This other idea, or the subtitle, Notes on an All-American Family, was really my challenge to people who believe that if you don't have a nuclear family, 2 kids, a white picket fence, a little dog, that you are somehow not American. And I grew up in a household that was not that. I didn't have my father around. I had my mother and my 2 brothers. But I also would say that that is also an archetypal American family. It is an archetype that is created by circumstances, right? Historical factors, social pushes and pull. So I wanted to recognize that and challenge that. Like, no, this kind of family has value as well, and it won't be marginalized or diminished, or impugned as less than. So that is really me kind of saying we need to reevaluate the ways in which we kind of impugn the American family structure, which is also not to say that I don't think that kids should have 2 parents, or like people should get married. Like, I think that's the case too. I just think that when we have another kind of situation, that we shouldn't be so quick to kind of dismiss it or critique it in that sense.
Yeah, that's well, one of the parts again that resonated with me is, growing up, my family did not look like most of the other kids' families.
Yeah.
My mom and dad were not together,
Yeah.
and stepfathers and all kinds of stuff. So that all-American family is how I was able to relate to this book as well, because it was like, my family is American.
Yeah.
There's truth to that. And as a teacher, here's the nice thing, and surprising thing, and I think most of the NCUEA members know this too. Even your own families, as you were growing up as a student, you didn't know what the heck was going on with the student next to you, and yet
Right.
you assumed as a student that everything was great. But now as a teacher, you realize all the challenges that our students are bringing, all the portfolio of experiences that our students bring to our classes, and we just have a more, I guess, deeper understanding of the diversity that is America and the American family structure.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. And fortunately, somebody asked this question because it goes back to the question I had about your son. Well, let me qualify that. This isn't about your son, but it helps talk about some of the conversations you might need to have with your son. What do you say to young men who might be selling to stop them from selling? Or conversely, and this goes to your son, what would you say to your son to, keep him off the path that you went on?
I think I wouldn't. I mean, I think to say don't do it is like almost futile. I think most kids who are thinking about selling drugs or engaging in some kind of criminalized activity are doing some survival math in their head, right? They're trying to figure out what the circumstances are. They're trying to figure out what are the cost benefits of me engaging in this activity. Is it worth it? And so I would try to show them as much of the math as I could. I would also try to show them as much of the history as I could. So for example, hustling, right? If someone said, man, I'm a hustler, I would try to show them like, well, where does hustling come from? Why is it marginalized? Why does hustling look like this in this community and it looks like white collar crime in this community, right? So I would try to give them as much information as I could. And then I would say, what decision looks like the most intelligent decision for a person who is as smart as you are, right? If someone would have laid all that out for me, it's possible that I still would have sold drugs, but it would have been much harder to make sense of that to myself. And it might not have gone on for as long as it did. But I also think in this age, it's harder to convince people to not sell drugs in certain instances, because now what is legal and illegal is constantly is changing, right? So now the government in corporate America is getting in on selling drugs. Like, I mean, if we look back at the history of cocaine, right? Like, we all know that cocaine was legal for a little while, Coca-Cola, and then once the government had the Harris Act, I can't remember what year this is, maybe 1914, in part because they had created this idea of a dangerous black man who was on cocaine, right? So they made us into monsters in order to criminalize cocaine. And then we had all these years where it was criminalized and we got penalized for it. And now they are changing that, right? So I would talk to them about that history and give them as much information as I could, and then say, all right, what kind of decision are you going to make given all of this information? I would also, point out that really, if you look at long-time hustlers, it does not work out well in the end. I had many men in my family who did it, and the ones that held on, they all had 20 to 30 years of like a really, kind of terrible life. So yeah, there are no retirement plans, and you don't get out of this unscathed.
Yeah. You talk about the history portion of this, and there are so many of us as educators who forget that, well, we don't forget necessarily in this audience,
Yeah.
but outside of this audience, we forget that, the way to connect with students around history is to teach them something that's relevant, that they can learn from and use. And so, ethnic studies, and just talking about people's lived experiences and the truth, like you said, the truth of our history, not just the whitewashed version of it, is really important. Another question that we have is, let's see, what can we do as educators and as a union to support the realization of racial justice? From your perspective, tough question.
I mean, I think you all are doing it. I think, hopefully you're engaging with, 1619. Hopefully you're all teaching Between the World and Me. Hopefully you're all teaching poetry, the work of Natalie Diaz, the work of Soma Sharif. Hopefully I think you're talking to them about the ways in which gender equality and inequality are connected to racial equality and inequality. I think that it needs to be multifaceted. I hope you're having them look at, artwork, the artwork of, I mean, obviously Kehinde Wiley is a big one, but he's, Carrie Mae Weems, and really having those conversations, multidisciplinary texts that we're giving them. Claudia Rankin, obviously. I mean, they're all like the ones we normally go to, but I think there are so many other people that are doing this kind of work that we need to expose them to. I think we may be doing ourselves a disservice by just telling most kids, if you read James Baldwin, like, you're good to go on, anything that has to do with race. Like, yes, James Baldwin is great, but there are also a lot of other people who deserve our attention. We might need to read outside of America, read Fanon, right? I mean, a very great thinker on race and inequality. So I hope we're doing that. I hope we're also modeling the experience in the classrooms. And I hope that if you are in a position to hire people, that you are getting Black and brown people, because I don't know what the current scholarship kind of is testifying, but I think I read something that Black and brown kids learn better from Black and brown teachers. So if you have a position to put some Black and brown people in position, then do so. And as a union, y'all get your money. They will pay you.
Yep. And couple things. First, all kids benefit from having Black and brown educators.
All kids, that's what it was. Yeah.
All kids. Your other statement is right too, but we have to make sure that people understand that in white places, Black and brown teachers are actually beneficial to white folks too. So that's one thing. And then the second thing, you mentioned a lot of people that we should be reading
Yeah.
And some of us know those people, some of us don't. I don't know how we can capture those names from you. If you could like send us an email or a text,
I think I'm on this
type it in the
chat.
chat.
Let me see. Can I type? Let me see. If I do
But
this,
we want to have those names because
okay, I just sent
this
it out.
audience
I think it was to
loves
the
it.
panelists though. Hold on, let me see.
Yeah.
Panelists and attendees. Okay, let me try this and see if everybody gets
Oh,
it.
don't worry about that right now. We want to ask more questions too.
Okay.
Let's see. How do you change mindsets? How do you change mindsets of us when we're growing up? How do you help us identify and see ourselves the way that you see other people and you see yourself? And this kind of goes maybe back to your son again. And how do you help young Black men see themselves differently? What do you say to them so that they don't want to, think of themselves on the scale at all? They don't want to be partners. They don't want to they want
Yeah.
yeah.
Man, I think if I had the answer, I feel like I would be Bezos right now. I'd have a website and be selling the answer. But I do think that I saw a video the other day of a guy named James Harden, an NBA star, James Harden, former MVP, and he was with a rapper named Lil Baby. It was his birthday, and James Harden had given Little Baby as a birthday gift a $200,000 watch, $100,000 in cash in a duffel bag. And I thought, I mean, obviously he has the wealth to do that, but I was like, that is, to me, does not seem like the best use of your wealth. And also, what does that show all of the young people who look up to James Harden and who think that Little Baby is the best rapper of his generation? And it is very hard as an educator to be able to challenge that kind of popularized notion of success, of kinship, of brotherhood, of sisterhood. So I think that we are up against, a lot of challenges. But I will also say that I think that one thing to do is to expose. So when I go into the prisons, one of the kind of concepts is this idea of a credible messenger. So that like people might be more likely to listen to me in a prison because I have been in prison. So I also feel like in the classrooms that maybe exposing kids to credible messengers, whatever the field is, people who have that experience, but not only succeeding in whatever the subject is, but also in not succeeding and in failing and in having the ability to talk about what that failure looks like and why they might have failed. I think that's also a way to educate kids, to give them a kind of holistic view of what they want to be. So I think, there's that. And I feel like we also really have to keep writing fair critiques of popular culture, writing fair critiques of what it means to be so obsessed with ourselves, to be so obsessed with social media, writing critiques of what it means like to give someone $100,000 in a duffel bag. Like, what does that say to the community? So I think that, but also I said fair critiques, right? So it's not just a criticism because you think you're better than them. It's also trying to imagine what might be the circumstances of the other, which made them do this. So I think we need a lot more of that, and we should expose our students to those kinds of holistic views. You might want to teach 1619 along with 1776 and see where they diverge on their ideas of Americanness and nationalism and what it means to be a citizen, and then talk to them about why one might lean this way and one might lean this way, right? So I do believe in that kind of dialogue, and all we can really do is equip people with the information, right? Because I don't really feel like, I mean, I guess we can well, we have proven that 48% of us can be indoctrinated to believe something, at least. So there is indoctrination, but I don't know if educators want to be indoctrinating children or if they want to be equipping them with the skill set to kind of survive, not even survive, to thrive in our current culture.
That's right. Survive and thrive. And
Yeah.
here's the biology for you. Here's the biology. You see, no questions about the brain. No questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's we did go a little bit over time, but I thank you for sticking with us.
Yeah.
And I really want to thank all of our NCUEA attendees and the NCUEA leadership team for making sure that we had such an amazing end keynote speaker. Survival Math. Survival Math. The link is in the chat. It's a great book, and just thank you so much for spending time with us. Any last words before we turn it over to President of NCUEA, Brent McKim? Mitch, any last words?
I'm just going to put some of those titles and authors in this panelists and attendees chat for you all. And thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Princess. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Alfonso, Carla, Kumar, Douglas, Robert. I see you. I appreciate you.
All right, thanks so much. And now, Brent McKim.